And we had like a brief moment from our QA team where they were like dying inexplicably and they couldn't figure out like what the fuck, like I'm just taking damage because they weren't even realizing that there was like this little worm chasing them around, like biting their ankle.
Butterscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 475 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and I'm the miscellaneous programmer.
I'm Sam and I'm the artist.
And today is July 3rd, 22 by 4 all. So this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry.
Yeah,
Sorry, we're on break.
Forgot that part. Yeah.
So yeah, we're on break. So I'm only doing a half job here of podcasting.
Just really dialing it in.
Yeah, you got to really dial it in. I'm on
I
vacation.
can feel the margarita wafting off of you.
Wait.
You know?
Yeah.
Are you dialing it in or phoning it in? And also,
Yeah.
what's the difference and why? You know, because dialing it in, that's like getting more precise or something, right?
Now, but
Phoning it in-
hold on. Profanity warning. All right, go
Yeah,
ahead. Yeah.
But phoning it in,
You're
phoning
right.
it in means
Dialing
like you're
it in
doing
is
a
when
bad
you get
job.
more accurate.
Yeah, but what? Well, I guess I could see dialing it if not from the phone concept, but like a dial, because it's like
Maybe like a
shows you
radio dial where like, when
yeah,
you're
yeah.
trying to like really get it onto the good signal.
getting on there.
You know?
I feel like
What about-
phoning it in is when you like call someone and you're like, oh yeah.
Somebody else deal with this.
Somebody else deal with this. I don't want to do this. And you're kind of just like,
Just phone it
handing
in.
it off to someone else. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's of course an ancient saying because we don't call people anymore.
Nobody dials anything
You know,
either.
if I want something done, I go to the website and then I type a thing in there and then they send me an email and then they put me on their newsletter. Then they sell my data. Then 2 weeks later, I get an email about how my data got leaked. And then I go onto a different website to get that fixed.
Yep.
And then that gets leaked. And then I get more
Yeah,
emails.
yeah,
So that's kind of the new method.
I needed to do an after hours urgent care a while ago. And I didn't have I was like, oh shit, what's the thing now? You know, to because I didn't have the app on my phone. And I was like, so I had to so I felt like going back to my insurance card. It's like, oh, use this, whatever the fuck it was called thing, you know? So I go to their website and they really want me to get the app. So I'm like, okay, fine. So I get the app.
Of course, you got to have the app.
Gotta have the
You can't
app.
do stuff without the app.
So first I click the button to get the app and it takes me to the iOS store, which I'm on an Android. So
Of course.
not particularly helpful. So I go back and go look for a fucking link.
There was no way for them to know that.
There was no way for them to know that. So I finally get it onto the store, download it, and then it just runs me through all these hoops of signing up. It's fine, whatever. And I finally get to the end of all of that, and they're like, cool, now you can start an appointment, start a virtual appointment or whatever, you know. So I hit that button, asked to fill out all the details about why, blah, blah. So do all of that. And it's like, cool, your appointment will start soon. We'll let you know when there's somebody ready. And I'm like, cool, okay. You know,
Slick.
but the way that they do it is I'm in the app, I'm right there, but they send me an email and to tell me that the provider is ready.
Yeah,
So
and see-
so I had to just look at my email and wait for it to appear, which took 15 minutes.
Are you in the urgent care facility
No. This is
during
This
this?
is one of those things you do from home.
I was like, why don't they just say your name out loud?
Pure
for you to see the person?
telehealth.
That's
But I mean, it's just as stupid as that, though, right? Because I got the app. Presumably the app could be here's note. And I also asked me if I had enabled notifications. So I was like, yes, you know. So in theory, I have everything that I need right there in this app they fucking sent me to go
But
get.
they're like, instead, we're going to deep link you from your email.
Yeah, but and that would then you would think that's what they would do, right? But no, the link just takes me to their fucking website, and I do the whole telehealth thing in the browser.
What?
And then it finishes.
I mean, I had a doctor's appointment last Friday and they sent me a thing before and they're like, you have to fill out all this stuff before you come. You know, it's like all this medical history and blah, blah, blah. I'm getting a new primary care doctor. So I spent 30 minutes compiling, just a library of knowledge about myself. And then I went there and they called me in, right about the time that my appointment was supposed to start. And then for an hour, they asked me a bunch of questions about my medical history, which I had already thoroughly
I
answered.
actually stopped doing the e-check-in stuff. That is basically because it requires all of those. They're like, you need to update all this information. And I'm like, there's nothing to update, buddies. I'm not doing
You're not even going to look at it. You're just going to throw it in your big data pile
Skip,
forget about it,
Yep.
So things have really improved, I feel.
Certainly.
Societally.
Yep.
So
Yep.
I can't wait to see what happens
great.
next.
software just keeps getting better.
It just keeps getting better. Also, we'd like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your recurring donations to help keep the podcast going. Now, because we're on break, we don't give a shit.
I don't care.
Yeah.
Yep.
I had a margarita in my oatmeal this morning. So
Oat marg, as they call it.
the old oat marg. I'm having a hot toddy right now. It's just only alcohol.
Yep.
That's all I've been consuming. I think I'm going to die. Actually,
You may. Be careful.
I mean, eventually. So
Oatmeal margarita sounds texturally like the most horrifying thing. Like,
Let's tell you guys about the time I tried to
gotta
make
be
coffee
warm.
oatmeal. It was a bad fucking idea.
Yeah, I remember that. That's gross.
That's not good at all.
Don't do it.
No, I'm actually not a drink. I don't really drink, but
you
just
could though, because it's break.
that's the mindset that I'm in though.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm in that mode.
Mindset. Yep.
Yeah. So we're just going to do questions because, well, nothing's happening in the studio this week because
Everyone's
we're on
gone.
break. Yeah. Actually, there are lots of things happening because we're all still doing stuff because we can't help ourselves.
Yeah, I'll probably work on some stuff today.
Yeah. But we're just going to get into some questions from our listeners at podcast.bscotch.net, and we'll just see what happens. So let's get into it. Highest upvoted question comes from RunnyunkieVarkkool, who says, what is your art asset creation pipeline? I'd love to hear how you go about concepting, creating, and implementing the art in the games. If you want to get specific, I remember in the past Sam spoke about being frustrated by the tedious process of sizing and exporting assets to a usable form. Is this still a big pain in the ass now, or have you developed new tools or processes?
There are a lot of parts to that pipeline, I tell you what.
There are. I think it basically goes, we'll start in the abstract, which is the creative side. Okay. You got to sit down and you're like, what are we even doing? That's the first question you always ask. What are we making here? You don't just,
because you got to know what you're going to try to put into the game.
What and
before
why.
you can start to make the thing.
yeah. And so especially early in dev, before there's a lot of context in the game already established that you're building into, which is a lot easier to do. But especially early, I literally have a list of like 20 questions that you write the answer to when you're making a new thing, which might sound kind of insane, but boy golly, does that save a lot of time. So
It's kind of like the surgeon checklist thing, right? Like,
exactly.
if you there's a lot, and none of it's that complicated. But if you forget one piece of it, then you got to do the whole fucking thing over.
And you left a sponge in someone.
Yeah, and that's not good.
You don't want to leave a sponge on anybody. So yeah, basically what you do is you combine the combination of like, yeah, it's the high concept that you normally think about when you're like art. You know, is it like a bat rat or like a frog rat? That's like that sort of plane of existence, right? But then you get into other stuff, which is like, does it need to adhere to the grid? Is it going to flip? Is it solid? If it's solid, is it too tall? How tall can it be? How big is it? No. And then give it all that information. Is it going to be animated? If so, how are you going to slice it? Does it need skins? Blah, 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 blah. So there's 1,000 of these stupid fucking questions, basically, that are not the art part that you normally think about. Like, ooh, fun. Let's go make some art.
It's just the set of constraints you're developing the art within.
Yeah. And so
Constraint check.
that establishing even what that list is, there's like a generic one that I can just use for I'm making a piece of art. And then there's the technical one that applies, that basically the pre-production in games is for figuring out what the fuck those questions even are. And then once you kind of have done that, then you use it every time. So that's part one. Part two then is just a bunch of sketching after finding references. So you go grab some pictures off Pinterest, off random stuff on Instagram, off the internet where you're like, what's a bat look like? I don't know, And then,
what you want to do is you want to pack your brain full of all the different perspectives and angles and nooks and crannies of the things.
You want to get specific, basically, right? Not just think about what you think in your vague human brain a bat looks like, but actually how does a bat nose?
What's going on with these bats?
What's going on with these bats? How do their eyes relate to their nose? I don't know off the top of my head.
And they don't know either, and that's the problem.
That's
you can't ask them. So you got to go to Pinterest.
Yep, you got to go Pinterest. Pinterest knows. Pinterest knows all about bats. So you just go look at some bats, pull those images in somewhere. You can use something like PureRef or just fucking copy paste them into your drawing program. And then, I do stuff like sometimes I'll trace stuff to figure out like what's like the shape language. Okay. It's an art term. It just means what are the volumes? It's like in programming, if you're putting some functions together or something like that to build a program. Shape language is kind of like that, where it's like you need certain shapes to be able to accomplish certain things, right? If you want to make a sharp ass mouth, you need some teeth. Usually they're pointy, right? But how pointy? That's kind of specific, actually. Like exactly how they're, you know what I mean? So you basically figure out the shape language problem. Then from there, you can start sketching. Sketch some nonsense as fast as you can. Talk to someone about it. And usually this is me talking to Seth.
And the sketch is taking the constraints into account, but it's not necessarily strictly adhering to them because it's hard. Speed.
Yes. Yeah. It's hard to keep 1,000 things in mind while being quote unquote creative, right?
Free and breezy.
Yeah. So people are like, could you make something totally new, but that also is recognizable and adheres to 1,000 technical constraints? That's how I get talked to.
Yeah.
Oftentimes. And the answer is kind of. You know what I mean? It's going to take a minute and kind of. And so after you finish that sketching phase, you talk to someone so you can be like, given what I thought I knew about how this is going to work, and now that we can see it, what's happening? Okay. Answer remaining questions, change stuff. And then you do like an actual kind of like a lock it in pass where you're like, okay, let's tighten this design down so it's what it should be because we theoretically have answered all the questions. All this is done in Clip Studio Paint in my case. The one thing that's annoying about that is it's not vector, which means that you have to like color stuff manually, which is super annoying.
What the fuck?
Yeah, you have to draw lines and then like redraw them because it's not. And again, I use the vector tools inside Clip Studio Paint, but they're garbage. You know, I just do it so scaling isn't an issue as we kind of load stuff in. So there's all that. And then once you get done with it, using 1,000 layers, polishing it, whatever, if it's going into spine, you got to shatter that thing into 1,000 pieces, bust them into animation folders. So if you got a bat, now you actually have like a bat head, bat body, bat wings, bat legs, bat teeth, as we talked about, whatever's going to move.
Bat eyelids.
You got to make them blink.
Bat fingers, because they got their creepy little... Got the little finger hands.
Little fucking like two of them on the end of those wings for some reason. Okay, so you get
now,
the two
of course,
fingers.
when you're rendering the bat in Clip Studio Paint, it's not like you're just drawing just a bat and then you're chopping it up. You actually have to draw it knowing that you're going to break it apart.
Yes.
And so each piece has to be constructed so that it can seamlessly blend with the others if it's broken apart, but still be its own whole complete thing.
Yes. And sometimes while you're doing this, you're like, ooh, actually, I need this other piece to be broken apart. And then you're like, whatever. And then you just cut it out. Okay. But then you got to go and you got to fill in, behind that thing. So let's say you cut off like the thing's head. And you're like, oh, I thought the head was going to be attached, but actually needed to wiggle around. You cut off the head, but now there's like a weird circular
gap.
Hole. Yeah.
Between the neck hole and the head.
Yeah. It's like its body is now a shirt. You know what I mean? Like with a collar hole. So you got to go back there, fill that shit in. So this is the process. And then you go reassemble it in spine, which takes actually not very long, basically seconds. And that allows you then to animate the damn thing. But actually, it just lets you move it. I wouldn't call it animating it until there's like other drawings involved. But
yeah, you need more frames and poses and stuff like that.
Yeah. And then you export all that. And then the tool we built.
Updating things.
Yeah, the tool we built, or that Adam built, I'm going to say we. Ada built with Stitch and VS Code allows you to set up these automated pipelines to make it so that as you're moving things around from Clip Studio Paint into Spine, from Spine into an exportable format, that you don't have to do anything about the movement. It just sort of magically is happening.
Slurped into the game and updates the game assets.
Yeah, so that is the pipe, and if that sounds like, I don't know, more engineering than drawing, well, it kind of is. And that's the truth. Like when you get into games, if you want to do game art, it's like you need to be keen on solving the integration problems, which is to say how your art meets the game.
In games, every part is technical.
Yes.
Everybody involved doing anything has to be, everything has to, in the end, it becomes a computer program, right? So like everything at some level is just foundationally technical.
Yeah, and there's classically there's that chafing between artists and programmers, which we also have internally, but it's always along the lines of the artist saying something like, "But can I make this like super fucking tall?" And the programmer being like, "If you do, I'm gonna have to go do a shitload of stuff to handle the fact that now we have super tall things." And then you got to be like, "Is it worth it?"
Yeah, well, because the first thing that happens is if you do that, here's the outcome if we change nothing else. Right?
Yes. Here's the problem.
Are we okay with that amount of
Is that
jank?
fine? And then if the answer is no, then it's like, okay, well, here's what I have to do to allow us to have that, or something.
Or
like
you go
that.
make it shorter, right? Basically.
Yeah.
Or there's a compromise where like we can do like a little bit of programming work if it's just a little bit shorter than you want, but still pretty tall.
But still taller than anything else.
There's always a negotiation.
Yep.
Yep.
So
I wouldn't say it's like a chafing. It's more just like the programmer is responsible for the constraints and the artist is responsible for pushing against them.
Yeah.
And so
together you make a perfect union, but
Yeah, it's sometimes like the constraints are just too much for what it is that you're trying to do. Like a kind of an interesting example for Crashlands 2 about tall things is when you're walking around the world, nothing exists outside of your field of view. So
basically the screen.
So just whatever's on screen, there's just like a little margin outside the borders of the screen where we spawn things, but beyond that, nothing is spawned. We have data saved about what's out there, but those things aren't instantiated in a way that like the game can actually render them or whatever.
Yeah, there aren't creatures out there running around until you get close enough to spawn them so that they're
There's a blob of data that says there will be a creature that is here when the player goes over there. But for now, it's just a blob of data, right? And so when it comes to tall things, the problem we have with a 2D game is if you're walking downward on the screen, so you're walking south, right? Then the things that are down there at the bottom of the screen, they don't exist, right? Because there's like nothing below the bottom edge of the screen really exists. And so if suddenly a really tall thing pops into existence slightly off screen down below, then you'll see the entire thing just pop into existence, like the whole thing, right? And so it's this very kind of
the top of it is in view already when the bottom of it spawns.
Because we have to decide like where this thing is, and we always use the base, right? So like where that thing meets the ground, that's its actual location because it's a 2D game, right? And so
if you would accommodate that means that you like the first thing you would think you would have to do is basically say like, well, we just have to spawn things for lower, right? Which
we did.
Yeah, which at first you might be like, well, who cares? It doesn't seem like that big of a deal, except that it's 2-dimensional, which means it's a squared problem, right?
It's an area problem.
It's an area problem.
A lot of things.
Yeah, so if you're like, oh, I want things to be two tiles taller than they currently can be, right? That what you're actually saying is I want 2 tiles times the width of the screen, right?
Yeah. Which spoilers a lot.
It's a lot. So that's new spaces that have to be checked every single frame to figure out like, do we need to spawn something or not?
So think about it this way: like if it's like 20, if your screen is like 20 grid spaces wide, and you just want to add 2 more grid spaces to the bottom to the spawning area, then suddenly you're spawning 40 more grid spaces worth of stuff at a time. And those things have to now get checked for collisions and they have to be processed and all kinds of other stuff. Right. And so, it really ramps up very quickly. Yeah.
So the way we handle it is basically to take into account how tall a thing is when saying basically when to load it. So if it's super fucking tall, we act as if it actually lives a few tiles up, if that makes sense.
Well, we do both, right? So it basically like plants an invisible flag higher up on the screen, kind of even with where at the top of the image is, and says, hey, if this little invisible flag ever gets on screen, then go ahead and spawn me as well, right?
Yeah, so rather than being like, okay, now we need to add all that extra area to check, you're basically just saying, let's just have this thing have 2 checks. Yeah, the tall guys get 2 checks instead, one at the top, one at the bottom.
And you kind of see this in 3D games. They'll do similar kinds of stuff where different kinds of objects will spawn in from different distances.
Yeah, because you don't need to see like a teacup at 100 yards. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but you do need to see like the building that the teacup is in, right? Yeah, it's because of course, if a large thing pops into existence as you approach, then you notice, but you don't really notice with smaller things. And so this is kind of a technique that's used kind of everywhere. But again, like at baseline, you have to kind of figure out how to code up those systems, and once you have them, then that dictates what is going to look good. And if you want to expand the scope of the types of things to visually represent in the game, like really big things or really small things or super detailed things or whatever, then you've got to go back and kind of redo some of the code to accommodate that bigger scope of stuff, right? So so it's pretty tricky.
Yeah.
And there's also a point where you just have to say, all right, well, we got to make the game, right? And so like we've got what we've got. Let's just operate within our constraints. And like if you go back and look at the first Crashlands, that was very much that game where like
as soon as we got everything working, we're like, all right, we're done.
Yeah. And so, we used Perlin noise to generate the world and stuff like that. And that already was like a big undertaking to figure that out. And we were under some other time constraints as well. And so everything in Crashlands 1 is just one grid space and nothing is really that tall. And I think depending on your device and your aspect ratio and stuff like that, there are times in Crashlands 1 where you will see things pop into existence at the bottom of the screen, particularly the large glazers in the tundra.
Yeah.
They're
The
antlers.
deer with like
Yeah.
super tall, big antlers sticking up. If you walk straight down and there's a glazer down there, you'd be like, boop, and you'll just see its antlers appear at the bottom of the screen.
But if
So
you walk up, you'll never see that happen because the bottom's already there. Bottom's already got spawned, you know?
it's all good. Yeah. So it's a lot of negotiating between programmer and artist. But yeah, and we also have lots of other tools that we use after that export process for integrating stuff into the game, which we've talked about, like the game changer and those kinds of things before. So definitely go, give those episodes a listen.
Whichever
I don't know
ones
which
they're
ones
in.
they
those
are.
ones.
But, they're back there.
But this is also why alignment on the team is so important and what you're aligned on, right? And so, because if you as a programmer just like, I just want programming to be easy, or if you're as an artist are like, I have all these cool ideas, I just want to do them, but no matter how hard it is to make those things work in the game, right? Then that's where you just end up with permanent conflict that doesn't serve the game in any useful way, right?
Whenever people have or talk about like art departments and programming departments as separate entities for like a game, I'm just like, I don't understand how you.
That's a great way to just have a shit ton of meetings and get nothing done.
Yeah, that's what it feels like. It's crazy.
It really, the more we've tried to do stuff asynchronously like that, the worse outcomes we get.
Yeah, it really
like
only
things
works.
people need to be paired up.
Yeah, it really only works once you've fully hardened the constraints of certain kinds of things, right? So like we have very known and very hard constraints now about like components, basically a lot of the simpler stuff, which means that essentially like myself and Anne could just the two of us can just build those things because there's no more, the considerations have already been taken into account with regard to like all the technical constraints.
And the set of constraints is so specific, but also pretty simple for those that you got a lot of freedom to work in a very specific, obvious space. And so you
can
don't
test
have
it
to
yourself really quickly.
Yeah. You don't have to
Well, 'cause
put it in
that's the other thing, too,
spine. You don't, that's all. It's all
As the constraints get more complex and nuanced too, right? That also means that it becomes really hard for anybody who's like making content against the game's real constraints, right? Whether it's art content or text content or whatever it is, it becomes harder for you to actually like know for sure, right? Like, does what I'm doing fall into that? Is the thing that I want to do actually that seems like it's outside the constraints? Is it actually outside the constraints, or is there so much nuance here that I actually just can't tell for sure, right? Which is why even when things get pretty solidified, unless they're also simple, then you still kind of can't get away with just like,
still got
artists do art, programmers do programming. That's the whole thing.
Yep.
All right. Next question comes from PureKnix, who says, considering the advancements you've made with the game changer, workflows, and art style, would you even be emotionally capable of revisiting your older games to add additional content? Would you eternally damage your relationship with your past selves just by trying to work with the product of your previous selves? How much has changed in terms of your current skill level compared to work on prior games?
This is the classic looking back at your old work problem.
I wouldn't be emotionally damaged. I think financially it wouldn't make any sense at all to go back. But emotionally, the thing is, I actually like working in Inkscape from just a like feel perspective. I love working.
It's a great tool.
It's everything downstream of just doing exactly, just making the art. Everything else I just talked about, basically, that becomes completely fucking untenable when you're working at scale and on animations and stuff like that. So I would not want to do.
And we no longer have, because the pipelines that we were using at the time for like Levelhead and stuff, right? They've always been some kind of a janky apparatus or another, right? But they've always needed some kind of syncing mechanism. And that's always been independent of our primary one, which is Git, which is what all the game lives in, right? Because art assets and code have just really dissimilar problems related to syncing that have to be handled. So it's always been just kind of a separate thing. And we used to have the Inkbot was the name of the robot we used for Inkscape, right? For all those assets. That thing is not alive. The code's somewhere, it's in Git. Like the code's in Git somewhere. Like we got
we could resuscitate it if we had to,
but it would be some, even that would be some effort to get that thing going again. And it mostly because actually, honestly, at this point, it'd probably be easier just to remake it be like, okay, what were we doing? And just remake that thing, rather than try to get the old one to work again. And I think that's kind of the funny thing with a lot of this stuff is that at some point you get so far beyond what you were doing that the question of like, can I get in here and like fix a thing or add a thing, or do I need to just redo this, or do I remake the entire thing? You know, like the exact level of difficulty of those like could get pretty wild in terms of like you'll be looking at a thing that seemed huge at the time. Like if I'm thinking about the Inkbot, I think it's a good example. Like at the time, I spent so much time building that thing. It was so hard. And knowing what I know today, all the stuff that I've learned, like that's probably a day. That's probably a day-long project, you know? And I spent weeks.
And it'll work better.
Yeah, it'll work way better. And I spent probably a few weeks building it, and then it broke all the time.
Yep.
Like every, I don't know, 2 to 4 weeks, I was like, oh, fuck, I got to figure out how to fix this. And I didn't know how to fix it. And so like every time I had to fix it, it was hours and hours or a couple days of work, you know? So I think that's one of the interesting things about revisiting old stuff is playing that game of like, okay, what is the move here? And it's not the case that you focus on something like the scale of Crashlands that the answer is ever going to be, oh, just remake Crashlands. That's the easiest way to solve the problem, right?
Yeah, right.
Because once the scope is big enough, it doesn't matter how much better you've gotten at stuff. It's just the scale is too big. But the approaches to fixing things might include a big overhaul of some aspect of that old project.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things for the older games as well is that Game Maker has changed so much.
Yep.
Even in the time we've been working on Crashlands too.
Yep.
Yeah.
Which is insane. Yeah. Because like I remember we first started, we're trying to figure out how to put equipment on this traditionally animated body thing that we're doing in Spine. So like, can you wear a glove of one type and a boot of a different type? And Game Maker didn't have multi-skin support. So the answer was actually no. So we had to roll our own way of managing that, which has basically makes the player spine file like really complicated. But that's a thing that like now we could do, but actually transitioning away from the current model would take a lot of time and effort and not really be worth it given how many more armor sets we have left. Right. But that happened like a year into dev. So we were like, all right.
Yeah, because like we were saying earlier, at a certain point, you get locked in by your constraints, however you set the system up, and you got to go. Like you got to make the game
something
built around that. And so, yeah, like back in the first Crashlands, one of the things that, you know, like as an inexperienced programmer, I didn't have any other frame of reference, you know, for whether this was good or bad. It's just what I had to work with. And in the first Crashlands, everything that you see, so like a tree or a sawgrass or whatever, is its own unique hand-coded object. So like we have like log tree, and there's a thing called O_log tree. It's an object that's a log tree. That
not every individual log tree, right?
No, but
every
the type
kind of thing.
Yeah. And Game Maker didn't have custom functions at that time, so I couldn't say like, oh, like for a log tree, like here's a function for what happens when it takes damage, right? And because of that, every single one of those objects has just something called if user event 0.
Yeah.
Which is
user event 0 days. Yeah.
Which is the user event. So it's a custom defined user event that you can't name it. It's just called user event 0, which is the thing that happens when that object gets interacted with. So in the first Crashlands, every single thing can only have one way of being interacted with because there's just user event 0. So if you're going to chop a tree, event user 0. Yeah. If you're going to hit that tree with a harvest bomb or whatever, well, we can't use event user 0 because that's already used up for being chopped. So there's like each harvest bomb has its own script for what to do to each different type of resource, you know? So like, going back and trying to work with that stuff, like I could definitely do it. I don't want to do it.
Yeah, the cognitive load is so high for trying.
And in a weird way, it makes it easier to work on stuff from back then because everything is hard coded in. And so like if I wanted to change the behavior of a glidopus, I could do that by opening the glidopus object and I could just change the glidopus and nothing will affect anything else in the game because nothing is connected, right? So nowadays it's kind of the opposite problem where like it's much easier to work on in the present because everything is very systems based and very flexible and lots of things can do lots of things in different ways. But you have to have a better sense of the overall system because if I want to change, how the player's swing animation works, well, that animation code doesn't only live on the player. It's used across the whole game for everything. And so if I change that, I might fuck up a bunch of other things.
You have to know about all the knock-on effects. And this is why if you read books like Clean Code or listen to advice about how to organize projects and code and stuff, right? This is why there's so much fucking nuance there, right? And that the gradation between things being abstract and reusable and being specific and concrete and non-reusable, right? Because most of the advice that you hear, which is like without, in the non-nuanced take, the good advice is to like push things towards abstraction so that it becomes, because the idea there is, well, if you're reusing stuff, then you don't have to do as much work. You can fix things in one place. Like there's all kinds of good reasons where that's true, right? But as a system grows in complexity, then your ability to understand what happens when you touch these things that are now used by a jillion other things, right, goes lower and lower and lower and lower. And so that the fragility of change management, basically, to these really widespread, sort of abstracted and generified systems makes it so that becomes its own new kind of burden. And so the game you're always playing as you're constructing these things is like trying to find some balance between the two extremes for the particular project that gives you good at the time you're working, that gives you good enough management of the project, but that also in the future, when you come back to it, is still manageable. And both extremes are bad, right?
Yeah, but when you get
trying
this
to find
big problem
middle spot
with like the systems approach, the more abstract approach, which we experienced with Crashlands too, because it's also our first time figuring out how to really even do that effectively, which is that you basically, it takes a longer time to get anything up and running. And then because anything that's interesting in whatever soup you've already built
is exceptional
means that you always have to expand the system to accommodate, right? Otherwise you're just right back in each thing as its own individual thing. And so there's a bunch of growing pains for us figuring out how to basically when to convert a thing into a more abstracted thing, or how to build systems that were so flexible baseline that like expanding them wasn't super annoying. It didn't.
Yeah, well, I think this is kind of this is one of the fun things. This is why I think these fields are so interesting. Is because you're always learning by trying. There's no one size fits all thing, right? But a lot of you'll see all these patterns that emerge if you like look into the theory the components of how people construct these things, right? And you'll see things like a plug-in based architecture, right? Or like you'll see all these different kinds of architectural approaches to developing any system, but mostly thinking about computer programs. And they call it architecture for a reason, right? It's like these big picture designs of how do things interact and all that kind of stuff. And
much like a building, once you've got it designed, every piece is kind of dependent on every other piece, right? Like you'll have a structural pillar in some room that's holding up the floor, and you can't just move that now because that's part of the architecture. That's what's holding the whole thing up.
But if you design it really well from the outset, which is this kind of complicated circular problem where it's like, well, if you don't know where the pillar goes and you can't make any decisions based on where the pillar is, but if you want to move the pillar based on the other stuff, then now you got to figure that out first, and it becomes this intractable problem, which is just the nature of it, right? But if you come up with good ways of thinking about how all the different components, because if you just know that buildings are made out of pillars and sewage and electrical and whatever, if you know the parts and you have a lot of experience of trying to get them to work together, trying different versions of abstracting versus making things specific and all that kind of stuff, then you can end up with ways of threading the needle of pushing the right things toward the right kind of abstraction in a way that still lets you interact with them in really specific ways so that you get the best of both worlds kinds of solutions. But the only way to find those, because they're also going to be specific to the problem domain that you're working at, is to keep trying to do it and then deal with the horrible consequences of the last try that you took, and just get better at it, and that's it. And then, but it always means that when you're going to work on a past project, you're like, oh fuck, this is
I actually heard
hard.
I think it was somebody was asking Todd Howard in an interview about whether they would be making remastering Skyrim, and his answer was false but diplomatic, where he was just like, oh no, it's just we totally could and we would love to do that, but we feel like it has so much charm and all this stuff from it's it's a product of its time, and we don't want to kind of wash over what it was. We want to preserve it the way that it is, because that's what our fans love.
That implies they would manage to fix things. And
and I'm just sitting here he doesn't want to fucking touch it.
Yeah, of course. It's barely standing up.
And it's been ported to so many different platforms and stuff like that.
Mods, you break all the mods,
which is,
no, absolutely not. That's the tricky part with all this, right? It's like, and even see this the Fallout 4 update that we talked about a few months ago. That like they released this patch that actually did fix like long standing bugs, after the Fallout show came out. But it also invalidated a bunch of mods. It's like a bunch of mod authors who hadn't touched their shit for like 7 years had to suddenly go back in and figure out how to like what tweaks that they need to make so that it doesn't break their stuff. And it's like I can't imagine trying to touch a game that is basically has that scale of success combined with that scale of build on top, where it's like a whole fucking platform in and of itself, right?
Well, and especially
I would touch a 10-foot pole, terrifying.
Yeah. Oh, this is a notorious problem for all open source projects, but especially kind of foundational ones. Take like Node.js, right, which is JavaScript that you can just run without a browser. Foundational to tons of modern web stuff, right? It's been around for a long time though. Like the first version was like early 2000s or something. Like it's been around for a long, long time, and it has this combination of like documented and undocumented behaviors, right? And over the years, as people needed to solve certain kinds of problems that they couldn't figure out how to solve using the documented part, right? They started fucking around and found the undocumented part of how it
They fucked around and found out.
But what they found out, though, is that they could pull off something that they wanted to do if they just like reached into the guts a little bit, right? Or if they relied
using
on
some probably unintended behavior of the system.
Well,
or
some of them
something
are
like
some
that.
of them are really unintended. Like there'll be something that throws an error when it shouldn't, and somebody then is like, "Ooh, I can use the fact that it does that to accomplish some their goal or whatever." Right? And so people start actually building in ways that rely on either undocumented stuff that was never intended to be like, this is how it works, right? Or on broken things, right?
Yep.
And so now you're maintaining, so now here we are, whatever, 20 years later in the Node world, right? And Node's still very actively maintained, still a core pillar of all of everything on the internet, right? And now when the team who's like working on stuff is trying to decide, what do we do? Like, here's our infinite list of bugs and feature requests, right? Mm-hmm. If we fix this bug, when we go to fix this performance issue, to do it, we would have to like modify this thing. Is there stuff out there that like the internet depends on?
Yeah.
That
and on that scale,
using the fact,
probably.
Oh, yeah.
The answer is probably yes. To everything.
You might accidentally like take down Google if you fix that bug. You don't know.
Yeah. And
you
that kind of thing
idea.
has happened, right? Where like you have entire swaths of things just like broken because of a little tweak somebody made in some foundational.
So this kind of reminds me of, so we talked in the past about in Crashlands 2 with the game changer, we could kind of do stuff with it that broke with our normal ways of thinking about things. It's like critters. So in the first Crashlands game, critters were a totally different type of thing that just kind of wandered around, and then you just kind of step on them. That was kind of it. They were just kind of cosmetic.
So they had really simple code, and they're not doing much.
Yeah, they didn't have combat code, and they couldn't do anything. They just walked around with some very, very light animation, if any, right? And so in Crashlands 2, we were like, we want to have critters because they're cool. Like it's just cool to have little critters just running around. Like it makes the environment feel more alive and stuff. And so I was working on some other stuff, getting some game systems sort of like set up, and Sam just showed up and he was like, "Hey, I just used the creatures system to make critters. I just made very small creatures with very little health."
That's why they're called critters. Little creatures. You know,
just small creatures.
Yeah. And so what that meant then was that the critters could actually be interesting, because creatures in Crashlands 2 have all kinds of ways of interacting with the environment, and they can fight, and they can like provide buffs and debuffs to each other, and they have all kinds of different animation states, like all this stuff, which meant that critters could do all that stuff too. So what that means though is that there's a situation that can happen with critters where because some of these critters can actually do damage because they might like attack other critters because they have their own little tiny ecosystem. Well, if you piss off one of those critters,
which is hard to do, but you can do it.
Yeah. So like if you hit it
without killing them somehow.
Yeah. If you do something, if you take a hostile action toward that critter that doesn't do damage to it, then it will be alive and it will be pissed off that you did that, and it will start attacking you. And And we had a brief moment from our QA team where they were like dying inexplicably and they couldn't figure out like, what the fuck? Like, I'm just taking damage because they weren't even realizing that there was like this little worm chasing them around, like biting their ankle.
It seemed particularly violent, you know?
Yeah. And it hardly does any damage, but if you're like at low health and you don't realize, because like maybe you were fighting an actual creature.
It's
and
basically
you, like,
super early game if you're just like almost dead.
Yeah, like you took some hostile action and accidentally caught this critter in the path, but you didn't kill it. Then suddenly you're just stuck in combat and just worms
He
biting.
whips out his little notebook. He's like, got your name. I'm coming for you. It's like a
The
John Wick.
grudge of the worm, you know. And so that's one of those things where like we could have said, oh well, you know, we don't want that, so we're going to go ahead and undo all that critter work and make actually like critter specific types of things, or you know,
more constrained, more
updates to it.
designed for like the separate concept called critter, whatever that means.
Yeah. But by the time we figured that out, we already had all the critters in there and they were all animated and everything's just hooked up and working. And also the bug's kind of hilarious.
Yeah.
So
I think, well, that's the place you get to if the systems start being really good, where you do get, I don't even know if it's like technically emergent gameplay, but it is emergent design in the sense of like,
It's unexpected.
yeah.
Or I guess it's basically it's unplanned design, right?
Yes. Yeah.
or
Which
just unplanned
maybe-
interactions. Or
Maybe that's what
mechanics.
emergent is.
It
It's just
kind
stuff.
of is. Yeah.
Because
I
like
could say-
emergent mostly is just like stuff you didn't realize would happen.
It emerged. It just
emerged.
showed up and you're like, oh, what?
Like you didn't do it on purpose and then it happened. But I think it's pretty rare to see an emergent property and then like look back at how it appeared and be like, I still have no idea how that happened, right?
Yes, yep.
You get that in like really complex systems that are not made by people, right? But like for the most part, stuff that's made by a person, even a lot of people.
Yeah, you know
you
the
can trace
scope
it
of what's
back.
possible.
Yeah, it might not
you
be
know?
a thing but it's usually because like the people involved with the design like just weren't able to
a
think
little
through
blind spot,
all of
you
the
know?
possible outcomes because it's
Like
fucking
somebody
hard.
made a calculator in Levelhead and it's like, you know what? Yeah, I could see, like, I don't know how personally to program a calculator in Levelhead.
Yeah, but Levelhead's got switches. Calculators
With
just-
enough time, I could
just put
figure it
switches.
out, you know. But yeah, it uses this switch system, and in theory, yeah, that makes sense.
There you can
that
build
would
any
be
computer in
Yeah.
Levelhead.
I don't know if it's that fun of a level, you know,
But it is a calculator. So
but it is a calculator. All right, next question comes from
and hey,
TimConceivable.
on that note, iPad just got a calculator for the first time built in, so Levelhead's
we truly live.
Levelhead's
in the
ahead of
future.
Apple,
wow.
which is pretty good.
Apple, you know, the calculator app industry is in shambles now. I don't know. They'll never financially recover from this. Actually, that's probably true. They will never
probably true.
financially recover from this. Next question comes from TimConceivable, who says, Orange Pixel, a solo indie dev I've been following for a while, has been making games for 20 years. Part of how he survived is by making mostly small but replayable games with very short dev cycles. He generally shoots for around 6 months per game. It seems to work for him pretty well. You guys started out with sort of a similar approach, but have obviously shifted course. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, and do you ever think about going back to making smaller games?
Think about it all the time.
Yeah.
I do think about it.
So,
Yeah.
kind of in line with what we were just talking about, one thing we discovered pretty early on is that the larger your portfolio is, the worse your life is. because you've
of
got to
maintenance.
maintain shit, you know?
Yeah, I think Orange Pixel only, I'm pretty sure, I think they only publish on, is it just on Steam or is it just on mobile? I can't, it's one of the, I'm pretty sure they're very narrow in the scope of like deployment.
Yeah, there's definitely ways to do it. And also, I think it's noteworthy that this is a solo dev because one of the things we kind of found with making Crashlands is that, hey, if you make a much more ambitious, larger game that has lots of modes of play and is available on lots of platforms, like if you do all that like stuff to make it big, then it's easier to attract a larger audience. At least that's what, like for us, that's what we kind of found. And if you're making a smaller game, then it's pretty hard to convince people to drop any reasonable amount of cash for it or to get large numbers of people excited about it.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
And there's always exceptions. There's always exceptions to everything. Like I remember around the time we were first getting started, Super Hexagon came out and just blew everything out of the water on the App Store.
And Flappy Bird.
For a couple of months. Flappy Bird, you know. And these things do happen, but for every one of those small games that makes like $1 million, there's a million of them making $0, right?
Yeah.
And that's not even, I mean, realistically, probably 10,000. Like not actually a million, but 10,000.
Yeah.
It's a lot. It's a lot of fucking games.
Yeah, it's also it's much easier to, from like a business perspective, oftentimes to pitch a game of a certain size, right? There is a too small scale as you're like, if you're trying to pitch to say Game Pass or like Apple Arcade or whatever else, like,
or even just trying to get featuring on Steam or something,
or get press to talk about your game.
Get any attention.
So
whatever.
So basically, for all the ways, there's a certain medium size. I think we're with Crashlands too. We're buttoned up against the top level of where we would prefer to be investing like total time and money wise on it. But like there's a certain size kind of like around where we're at, where it feels like a lot of the more businessy parts of the cycle stuff are kind of easier to get some traction on. And I think it's because the problem we've kind of arrived at is that it's very hard to distribute and market and then manage in the long term deployments of a game. So what that kind of points to is actually not necessarily trying to put out a bunch of them, but put out like some smaller number where we're trying to get to a point where we don't have to bet the whole farm on the thing, right? But also where it's big enough that it could attract that business attention. It's like half the farm. Yeah, it's like half the farm.
I mean, it's the idea of where all the costs are, right? And that was something for us. It was that discovery that there's an enormous amount of overhead that goes to launching, just the launch part of a game, but the launching and then maintenance, right, of any game. And you can cut that out, like Sam was saying, by being like, well, we'll just restrict to one platform and not do any marketing is a really good way to cut that out, right? But if you're trying to like put every possible thing into making the thing successful, then there just is there's a floor on how much time and effort has to go into once the game is done.
Yeah, it's essentially the not game part.
The not game. And the smaller the game is proportionally, the more that then sort of represents. But also, as you're saying, the harder it is to do that part is as the game gets tinier, 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 you actually can't invest that much because like you don't have as many levers to pull in the first place. But as the cost of that stuff, again, it just is high. And so if you're trying to launch 3 games a year or something, you're committing also to 3 launches a year, and then which is going to be overlapping at that point in terms of overlapping things that are happening, because it also takes a long time. Like there's like the initial launch is like everything is leading up to that moment, right? And then there's this tail of stuff that you're still doing, biz dev opportunities you're trying to entertain. Like tons of stuff is happening. If you just start layering those on top of each other by compressing your timelines and just doing more of it, then that becomes its own whole thing that stops you from doing the rest. Especially if you're a small team or a solo dev, it becomes impossible. You can't actually make lots of small games because even though you technically can, like you can make them. You can make them. You can't you can't launch them. Yeah, you can't. Yeah. You can't do the business part of.
The thing is, like we could make 50 games a year.
Oh yeah,
and we could make 50 pretty good games in a year.
50?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Flop Rocket was made in 1 day.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the original Flop Rocket.
The original. And then Butterscotch ID integration took 2 weeks. Right. And that was like the first time we tried something like that, So like mechanically,
you can cut it in half. You can make 20 games in a year.
We can make these arcade style, like free to play, smaller kinds of games. And especially with what we know now and what we're capable of now, we could do them pretty fast. But if we're thinking of like, let's say you did 3 games a year, then 5 years from now, you're going to get a note from Google Play or whatever. And they'll be like, hey, we're updating the minimum Android SDK requirement. And these 15 games are out of date and you've got to update all of them.
Yeah.
Right.
Or the SDK that you're using now violates blah, blah, blah terms, and you have 2 weeks to replace your ad platform with something else.
So the longer that timeline goes and the more games you put out, then the more situations arise where just suddenly you've got to kind of drop everything and then spend like a whole month or more just patch a game, deploy it, patch a game, deploy it. And you just do that forever.
Yeah, so I would say a strategy is switch from in the early days being more focused on basically the quantity of games to much more, and even with quantity of platforms, right? Like with Levelhead launching on 7 platforms simultaneously, to now being basically trying to be like as few platforms as we think reasonably we can either get business deals with or that are self-sustaining, right? At launch, that like the game fits. As few as possible, not as many. It's the opposite. And then
or it's not even as few as possible. It's not about how many, it's only the ones that we think have a significant return on effort.
And the other ones wait until post-launch, where basically if the game does really well, then we now know that like, oh, even if we thought that we'd make, I don't know, a fifth as much on X, Y, or Z because of the total volume of units sold or whatever else, that still would be great, right? So then that's a different calculation at that point. But then the other part of it on the game size is basically you make as much game as it feels like you would need to make to get the game itself to just sell itself on those platforms, right? Because it's like with Crashlands 2, we invested a tremendous amount of time and energy into the overall art and like world production quality of the thing, right? And that seems to have paid off in spades in terms of like overall rate of interest for the thing when it comes to people seeing it for the first time and wanting it, right?
And we get to carry that investment forward into the next thing.
Yeah. Did we have to make the game that we're making in terms of like just how fucking huge it is? Like, well, probably didn't need to be that fucking huge, but at the same time, like,
but we want it to.
We want it to be. So that's what we're playing, right? And so it's like, there's always that. You can never make a thing that's perfectly sized. So I think everyone figures out like a recipe that works. And especially in Orange Pixel's case, given when they started making games and if they've been able to carry their audience forward, it'd be interesting to see what they have to say about it. But my guess is that if they're able to carry their audience forward a bit, right? Like a lot of people who follow them, then some of the problems related to like the marketing issues, the launch issues, whatever else, do kind of dissipate in a way where if your team hasn't really scaled up, your costs haven't really scaled up.
But if you're starting at square zero every time for just a large number of tiny games, tricky. Like that's a brutal way to do it.
Yeah, everyone finds their skill.
Yeah, and honestly, if I were solo right now, I'd probably do that. I'd probably do what Orange Pixel does.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Because the other thing is if your resources are really constrained, which in this case would be time, because it's just you, right? Then there's certain things that you just have to say, you know what, I just don't give a fuck.
Yep.
And in that case, it would be, some 10-year-old game I made that has 35 players needs to be updated for Android.
Guess it's dead now.
Yeah.
Well, unpublished. Yep. Moving on. Because and there's kind of a clarity to that where when you're that constrained on things, and also like leverage wise, it changes the calculus. So let's say you make a game and you're a solo developer, and some platform shows up and they're like, "Hey, we'll give you $10,000 if you like port this thing and make it compatible." Right? Mm-hmm. And you're like, "Yeah, I'd do that." Right? It's just me. I get $10,000. Perfect.
Easy peasy.
If you're a studio of 10 people and something comes up for $10,000,
you're like, oh, that's a week of expenses. Like that's
if that. And then of course, then there's the long-term maintenance thing, and then it adds to the kind of logistical overhead of how you're going to manage things going forward with the maintenance of all your different deployments. Because communication is expensive, right? Yeah. If it's just you, then and you publish a thing on a platform, then you know that you did that. You don't have to tell anybody that happened.
This also is an interesting thing of doing biz dev as a indie in our position. Is the kinds of stuff that I'm fielding tend to fall into two categories. Where one is it's like people used to working with small businesses, where they just assume any amount of money is a worthy offer.
Your current income is zero, so everything is super high leverage.
Just the most lowball shit and be like, or they'll just be like, and we'll just do. Well, the plan will just be to do a revenue share model, and I'm like, how am I going to feed myself with exposure bucks? It's not. Yep. We can't move forward with it. So you kind of got that domain, which is most of what we get. But then you've also got this other side of a big business coming to. Oh shit! I'm losing my train of thought on this one. I had a point. I had a point related.
Well, I think I assume it's the fact when we're talking to the large business, we're talking Xbox and shit. We know that they have war chests, right?
They're publicly traded quarterly statements say that they have $80 billion of cash.
Yeah,
but we know that.
There's the power difference there that's crazy, right? Yeah. But they might want a thing that you have, and then it's a really weird thing because it's like, how do you?
Yeah,
but they don't need it, but they want it.
Yeah, that actually wasn't the one though that I was thinking. I was thinking about the idea that you get approached by these larger companies who are used to. So if they're not going to be the ones that lowball you because you're tiny, right? Mm-hmm. They might come in and be like, we only can conceptualize being a big company working with other big companies, right? So then because a lot of what I get, which actually I get a lot of pretty reasonable pitches in a vacuum, pretty reasonable pitches for hey, I want to do something like X with Crash, like OG Crash and something like that, right? And the biggest part of the pitch will be, and we'll do all of the work. So there's no cost to you at all besides basically rights and getting access to stuff, right?
Yep.
And they believe that. They believe that that's true, right? Because
no
to
cost
them,
to us. Yeah.
that there's no cost to us. And I'm like, what do you mean? There's like we would have to have somebody like organize the code, like transfer stuff. We have to sign agreements. We have to do legals. There's like infinite stuff we have to do.
Yeah,
We don't have 1,000 people on staff, or we could just take one.
Yeah, exactly.
Of them
But there's not
Exactly.
someone whose job it is to like only do that, and then therefore it doesn't impact the bottom line. Like that doesn't exist in a studio of our scale. And so no matter what we're doing, no matter what it is, like from these external parties, like it's like
doesn't match.
It's this
with what they
weird
expect.
mismatch all the time when because if you're really tiny, then where like you're just trying to feed yourself and so on and so forth, like Seth was saying, like you can get away with a lot. Like lowball offers can be pretty good for you as a solo dev.
Yeah, because it's
When
not a
you're really
lowball
big,
offer. If it's just you, I mean, it's fine.
Yeah, when you're really big, you're playing with other people's money the whole time, right? And everything is designed so that the other parties you're working with work the same way, basically, right? So like, there's all these assumptions that are in common, but you're in this weird middle ground where we're at, which is also funny because we're still really fucking small. So it doesn't feel like it should be a middle ground. We're still really small, but our expenses are high, you know, because we've got a bunch of full-time people on staff.
And we try to pay them, a good.
We try to pay them reasonably. Yeah. So you have this. So you just have this weird mismatch where people just come to us either expecting us to be a tiny company, like a person, or a huge company, and there's like no fucking.
They're like, you got plenty of slack. You can just like throw that guy over there on this thing for the next 2 weeks, and it'll be good. And it's like, no, that'll delay.
That's our only guy, though. We don't have any other guys.
Yeah, because that's the other part of all this bit of like, depending on how many games you're releasing and all that kind of stuff. Like, there's so much stuff that has to happen. And that's what we're talking about is this part that's unrelated to making the games, right? But that stuff that has to happen is also things like talking to biz dev people and trying to make a deal, right? Making a deal almost always falls through the cracks eventually. It almost never actually works, right? But when it does, though, that could be the thing that makes it so your studio gets to exist for the long term, right? And so you still have to decide always, like, oh shit, do I invest all of the time of like all the back and forth, all the reviewing legal documents, all this kind of stuff, which the other side is going to treat as if it's free, right?
Yeah,
because it is. Because they're just
that's
their whole job, and that's
it's
one
part
person
of
paid by
it's
the
already
company.
built into their costs. Yeah, exactly.
It's not the
while you're
owner of
doing
the
it-
company. You're not talking to the CEO of Microsoft when you're doing these negotiations,
Yeah.
right? But like they're talking to our CEO. You know what I mean?
So while you're doing it, you're not making games. And so to me, that's basically fundamentally where the lots of small games model just it works in the rarest of cases when basically like it's like one person doing it and their financial needs are extremely low because any other scenario, everything you need to be doing to capitalize on all this effort you're putting in to make these games means you can't make the next games. And if the model is basically make tons of small games, like it's not sustainable.
So yeah, I'd be curious how they manage that, like all of those other aspects of it, or don't. What they've managed to just be like, never mind, I don't want to do that. Because actually, like you said, you can get away with not doing a whole lot of stuff.
Especially if you're a solo person, and if your players know that, they're like,
Yeah,
good
customer
enough.
support stuff generally doesn't even. People are like, yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, expectations are different.
Also, like smaller games that you're not gonna like sink a shitload of time into necessarily, or like complex time in a way, right? Where it's like, oh, I built my base in this world, and then the fucking data got corrupted. Versus being like, I'm playing a roguelike and I lost my run. It's like, okay,
it's a
just play
roguelike,
again.
and that was going to
Fine.
happen anyway.
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways to design around these things in a way that makes it so you just don't have support requests stuff like that. But I'd be curious about that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it definitely seems like at the beginning, our philosophy, because like we come from kind of a game jam background. So at the beginning, our philosophy was do as much as possible. Just make as many games as possible, as fast as possible, and publish them on as many places as possible.
And tell as many people as possible using every platform that exists. And
Yeah. And now maybe it's also because we're getting older and tired, but nowadays it's like we want to actually do as little as possible. We want to do as
It's always
we want to do as few things as possible, but in like the biggest, highest quality way.
Yeah, I don't want to spend
that we
any
can.
time on something that doesn't meaningfully move the needle for us. It's just
but also at the beginning, everything had either unknown or known low leverage, right? And that's where we started, right? And so it made sense at the time to just try to do all of it. But then over the years, we've been able to kind of fine tune and figure out how do we choose the things that are, because it's still largely unknown, right?
I mean, Flop Rocket kind of changed everything for us, but nowadays that level of success would be nothing for what we need. You know what I mean? Because like our scope and our scale of our operations and what our expectations, like how much we were paying ourselves at the time, you know, like basically Flop Rockets allowed us to start paying ourselves, which was a game changer. But we weren't making much, and we really had to stretch that out, you know, over the course of Crashlands development. And so it's all relative. It was a huge deal at that time. But if we did that again and got the same result, then that would be a bad outcome for us.
Yeah, well, I mean, think about it, because like Flop Rocket made probably something like, at the time, a decent salary for one person for 1 year.
Yeah, but we split it 3 ways.
So we split it 3 ways over a few years.
It made a very low salary for anybody who works in tech.
Yeah.
But like a medium salary just kind of overall, you know.
And enough to sort of signal like, maybe... Yeah, maybe there's a way that we can make this work if we can, because that's what those things where you're like, oh, if we could make this happen, can we get a 3 times better outcome? You know, can we layer in stuff so that this is kind of true too, because in the earlier days also our plan in the long term was to like be layering game after game, because we were thinking about the tail of like revenue coming in, right? But our whole discussion right now is like, oh fuck that, the tail is just this expensive brutal part though, because the amount of revenue coming in goes so low for any title, except for the absolute biggest hits. But even those compared to their peaks, those the low
tail
parts
would be
are
like
low.
1%, you know.
Yeah, it's a tiny fraction, and that's where all of your maintenance and the other time costs come in is during that part. And so, yeah, we were naive at the time, thinking that was like the long-term business model that would make sense, was just like, just keep putting games out until the tail is fat enough.
Yeah. To be fair, we hadn't lived long enough to have to do any maintenance, so.
Yeah, exactly.
You know.
Yep.
You really underestimate maintenance, you know, and like you kind of see conversations, and also like conversations about maintenance all over the place. Nobody gives a fuck about maintenance. If you have like a politician and they're coming to like, all right, I'm running for mayor, and here's the thing, I'm going to increase our maintenance budget, and we're going to maintain our bridges, and we're going to inspect them more, you know, and everybody's like, what? Who gives this shit, right? And then finally a bridge collapses, and people are like, why didn't we do anything about this? It's like, because you were too bored. You were too bored of the idea of maintenance, because it's just not that interesting. But it's expensive, and the more things you have, the more maintenance you got to do, and you just got to do it. So you got to find that middle ground. Got to optimize, you know. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. We'd like to thank our producers Fat Bard and Sampa DeCoster for putting the podcast together, and thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the podcast archives. And as always, if you haven't yet, head on over to Steam, give Crashlands 2 a wish list. It'll help boost it up the charts and help the game have a successful launch. We'd appreciate it. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.